Hello there, everybody. My name is Russ, and today I'm going to be speaking to you about the best ways to protect privacy with security, because one of the things that we see in the world now is that there is a lot of privacy legislation, and there is also the cybersecurity side of things, and the two of them are sometimes excluded from each other, which shouldn't be the case because the two are really intertwined. So to give you a bit of background about myself, like I said, my name is Ross. I come from the networking and also the software development side of things way back in the day. But about 10 years ago, I moved into the information security space, working a lot with InfoSec committees and basically working with software companies to get their software and their compliance internally up to standard when it comes to information security. So in support of that, I've got my CEHV10, and then I also have a Certified Information Privacy Professional designation from the IAPP. So I straddle the cybersecurity side as well as the legislative side and the legal side of things. And today we're going to really dive into both, because companies have a habit of saying that cybersecurity should sit in the security department or the IT department, and privacy should sit with the compliance department, and the two don't meet, which doesn't make sense in this day and age. So to go into this in a bit more detail, let's talk about the history of major global privacy laws, because these really tie into the InfoSec side quite well. If we look at the middle column here, we're looking at the OECD guidelines. So this is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And in the 80s, they put together a guideline of 8 principles to handle privacy and to transfer data effectively across borders. So these guidelines included accountability, purpose specification, collection limitation, use limitation, data quality, security safeguards, openness, and individual participation. And basically the view is that these 8, if you cover them, means that you're covering data privacy well. Now, accountability means that you as an organization are taking responsibility for the data that you have and you're being held accountable. Purpose specification says that you are specifying what you are going to use data for. Collection limitation is taking only the data that you need. Use limitation is not using that data for something else. Data quality is that the information is up to date. Security safeguards is where cybersecurity comes in. And although this is 1/8 of the principles, it can be probably about 80% of the work that needs to happen in order to comply. So that sits under that security safeguards. Then we have openness, where we tell people what we're doing with data, and individual participation, so people can update their information with us. Now, these 8 principles in the OECD are really, really important, because most legislation around the world when it comes to privacy is built on these 8 principles from the OECD. If we look to the left, I know we've got a number of people from South Africa here. We have the PAPIA legislation, so the Protection of Personal Information Act in South Africa, which now came into play on the 1st of July, and we're in a grace period until the 30th of June 2021 to implement everything that needs to happen in a business. And if we look at the principles under PAPIA, you can see they're basically a carbon copy of the OECD. Then if we look to the left, on the western side of the world, we have PAPITA in Canada, and those have taken basically the OECD guidelines and they've split them into a few more to make them a little bit more specific. So you will see the same things coming through. Now, if we move to the right of these guidelines that I've got here, we've got the PDPB in India. I know we've got a lot of folks from India on here. The PDPB is the privacy legislation coming in India that's going to complement and or replace the IT Act. So at the moment, there is the IT Act, but it's not seen as sufficient in the eyes of Europe. And the reason why I say that's important is GDPR on the far right here is basically the gold standard of legislation globally. And it has progressed from the OECD over a number of steps. So the OECD came around in the 80s, it was updated in 2013. Prior to GDPR, we had something called the EU directive, which was a guideline based on the OECD guidelines, and that's been replaced by GDPR, which is a regulation that's hard and fast in place and also has similar traits. Now, if we look down the list of GDPR, we don't see security safeguards, but we'll see something that everyone here in cybersecurity should be very familiar with, and that is integrity and confidentiality. So that is talking to the CIA triad, and that is really, really important, that confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And we will dive into that in a little bit. Now, we've got these legislations. I've spoken about Europe, India, South Africa. The same kind of thing is seen across Asia and across Africa. Even the Middle East, we're seeing privacy legislation coming in there. Now, if we look at Asia, we've got very similar laws in Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, and South Korea. Malaysia and Singapore, much like the rest of these legislations, are based on the EU directive, which was based on OECD. So they're really similar around that. And then we also have Vietnam and South Korea with similar laws, but with some differences in there, and South Korea being the strictest in the region. So you can see that this is really a global thing. And if you're in cybersecurity, every single one of these speaks about some sort of security aspect and safeguarding that info. Right, so how does defensive measures in a cybersecurity space help for your legal compliance? Well, there's some important things to note from this legislation. And one of them is that a data breach is not only some sort of data leak. We often think about breaches as only being information that gets stolen, or that there's an accidental leak of information out there and suddenly stuff appears on the dark web. That is not the case. Under legislation, a data breach can be anything from disruption to services. It can be accidental deletion of data. So if you've got a whole bunch of data and you delete it without having backups, that is actually considered a breach in a lot of privacy legislation. It is disruptions to services. So if servers go down or connectivity goes down, that can technically be seen as a breach. But the most common one that we see and we hear about is when these breaches go public and information's been leaked. It can also be from social engineering. As we've seen in South Africa in the last 2 weeks, news has broken about 24 million records being leaked from a credit provider, which is quite a crazy, crazy breach. So because of this, and because we talk about breaches being a lot broader than just data leaks, that confidentiality, integrity, and availability of cybersecurity comes in very, very importantly for our legal compliance. Now, I spoke on the previous slide when we were looking at the different legislation about accountability, which is now prevalent across every one of those data privacy legislations. Now, accountability is the on-paper compliance. So that is where an organization has said, you know, we are going to comply with data privacy legislation, and these are our internal policies for it. So it's putting it down on paper what you're doing. And that's very important because every organization needs to have some sort of policy around this stuff, data security policies, things like that. But when you have some kind of breach and that goes to the regulator, your on-paper compliance is only one part of it. What will happen in the event of a breach or a suspected breach is likely that the regulator will come and inspect that operations match what's in the policy. Now, that's the important part where cybersecurity professionals come in. Your defensive measures that you put in on a network, on a server infrastructure, on a InfoSec infrastructure, so even in the physical world, ties in to what kind of penalties might play out when it comes to data privacy legislation. The more protection you have in place, the better it is and the better position the organization stands in when it comes to any sort of fines or implications that may come out of it. If we look at the case of South Africa and China as well, there are criminal penalties for data breaches in certain circumstances. And if you have the correct defensive measures in place, you won't stand much chance of going into the criminal penalties. It might just be administrative. But the more defensive measures you have, the better it is for you on that sliding scale of fines. Now, when we talk about these defensive measures, something we need to be very, very aware of as well is that the legislations talk about the current state of technology, and that includes the state of cybersecurity. If you think about it, it would be really silly to put a checklist of security measures into a data privacy legislation, because technology changes really, really quickly, whereas legislation moves slowly, and it's a slow progression through legislation. So what the laws say is they talk about state of technology, and then it's up to the regulator to see if you are adhering to the latest tech that's out there. So as cybersecurity professionals, you need to know what is the tech out there, what is the prevention methodologies, how do you put those in? Because things like two-factor authentication, say 5-10 years ago, was a nice to have. Now, the current state of technology basically says that two-factor authentication is an absolute must, and you have to put that in. And a regulator will look at that. Do you have two-factor authentication? Because that stops phishing and the likes of that. So if you have any sort of negligence in the cybersecurity space, that's where you are going to encounter higher fines and higher liability when it comes to this legislation and the penalties therein. So I want to take you through a bit of a case study that happened with a company that I worked with. And this was the case of a phishing attack. Now, what happened in this instance is that a salesperson in the organization received an email from a potential client that showed a purchase order number in the email along with a link. So in order to see what was on the purchase order, the salesperson had to select the link, go over and see what the document was. Now, this was a phishing email. So on the other side of the link was what looked like an Office 365 login, but it was not Office 365. It was a spoofed website. So the salesperson entered his user and password and nothing happened. Fast forward to a couple of hours later, when the organization internally started receiving emails from the salesperson with similar purchase orders. This was when, excuse the pun, something was fishy. Now, what they did there is they locked down the network really, really quickly, but it was still a case that now there was unauthorized access. Now, it's important and interesting to note that this wasn't unauthorized access in that someone came in and started downloading emails or sending emails externally using SMTP or anything like that. It was much more subversive than that, in that additional rules were added in Office 365 that any emails that came in were then published to an RSS feed on the outside. So you wouldn't have seen anything in email logs going out, but there was an HTTP request going out, publishing the emails outside. Now, in this instance, luckily, no personal information was breached in this, but what would have mitigated this entirely would have been two-factor authentication as a mandatory thing on the email systems. Now, this was a very, very lucky organization in the fact that they had a very well-defined response plan. And this is a key part where a cybersecurity professional comes in these, is that there was this response plan. They were able to lock down the entire network globally. It was a multinational company within about 15 minutes. So the data that was exfiltrated was very, very minimal because not many emails had come into the 2 mailboxes that were compromised in that 15-minute space. It took about a total of 2.5 hours to recover from it and have everything back to normal, which is very good timing as far as a data breach is concerned. But the key to that was this rapid response in a defined response plan. If you're still scrambling in an organization to know what to do when an incident happens, you're going to take a lot longer to respond. And the longer you take to respond, the more exponentially damaging an incident can be. So you really want to have that kind of defined response plan, but at the same time, preemptive help the organization greatly, because with two-factor authentication, even if that password was breached, there would have been that second layer that's set to the information. Very important here to balance those two sides and the impact that this would have on privacy legislation, because had there been personal information exfiltrated, and I think if this had lasted any longer, it probably would have, there would have been fines potentially for the company involved, which is definitely, particularly European standpoint, with maximum fines of 20 million euros, which will close a lot of companies' doors. Right. So the next thing I want to talk to you about from a cybersecurity practitioner point of view is that there is strategy and then there's implementation. And often this is where we see a big disconnect between privacy legislation and cybersecurity, because you'll often get advisory from attorneys and lawyers, and it will not be as practical in person when trying to implement it within an organization. Now, the nice part about legislation, and if you'll often perhaps, or not often necessarily, but a number of lawyers will advise that you have to do all sorts of massive exercises to comply, but it's not necessarily the case. Privacy legislation looks at what is practical for your organization size. So a smaller organization will be held to different requirements to say what a massive organization like Facebook or Google will be looking at. But the point is that your strategy must be practical and achievable. Because what happens in the legislations is there are these subjects. You have the controller under GDPR that's making the data, and then you have the processor who looks after the data, who actually does what the controller wants you to do. Now, if you are going to be a processor for a controller, say the controller is a bank and they are outsourcing information to you as a processor, they will give you a risk assessment to ascertain what your strategy is and what you have in place. And this is where, again, the cybersecurity professional comes in, because now you need to define what the organization has done from a security perspective to convince that bank that you are doing the correct thing. Now, it could be a bank, it could be an insurance house, it could be any number of companies, but you have to be able to prove what you've done. Now, a dangerous trap that a lot of folks fall into is when you respond on these risk assessments and things like that, you do it aspirationally. And that is saying that you fill them in, detailing a position you would like to be in, and not necessarily a position you are in. And it's very important to stay in the here and now when you're filling these in, because you can add additional liability to the organization by claiming to have something in place that you don't. So you want to avoid that. But by the same token, you will receive these risk assessments as a professional and as you're reviewing them, and they will often give you ideas as to what you could have in place. So you need to look at that and see whether there are certain things in the assessment that you want to implement internally as an organization. Because like we said, the more safeguards you have, the better your position is when it comes to any sort of liability and things like that. Now, something that a lot of folks do, and you see a lot of recommendations for this, is that you must implement technical standards. And one of the most popular is your ISO 27001. It is a fantastic standard, but it is a very expensive standard to implement, especially for smaller companies. And it is also quite cumbersome, and it doesn't quite cover privacy across the board. Remember, we spoke about 8 principles. It's accountability, purpose limitation, all of that. Your technical standards like ISO 27001 cover your security safeguards and a couple of pieces from other sections, but it doesn't cover privacy entirely. So it's also important to know that, yes, you can have fantastic standards internally, but it doesn't cover you completely for privacy. And you as a cybersecurity professional need to know that as well, so you can advise accordingly, because we may see it in the executive teams where people might think that that's the case, and it actually isn't. So it is this balance between practicality, security, and how you implement. Now, I want to take you through a second case quickly as I'm wrapping up on some of these things. And that ties into the last point on the slide, which is those enforcing requirements are often not those that are defining the requirements. Because you will see that the requirements that come through asking you for your strategy, what you're doing, how you're doing it, will come from risk departments and not necessarily security departments. And that's an important distinction to have, because these risk staff are not necessarily versed in cybersecurity. Now, I've worked with a number of companies where these assessments come through, and one in particular was roughly, I think it was 72 pages of information that between the sales department, senior management, IT, and cybersecurity had to complete to say what sort of protections were in place, and the majority of it spoke to cybersecurity. Now, that 72 pages was huge for the simple reason that what had happened is much of the questions that were asked were just questions from multiple assessments that were lumped into one. And it's important for you to know this because this will save you time later. Because what they had done, the company that was requesting this attestation, was they had included the questionnaires for American privacy laws like CCPA, European privacy laws like GDPR, African privacy laws like POPIA, Australian privacy laws like APP, and these laws all have slightly more additional things on top of them than perhaps just one or the other. So suddenly they're trying to get you to comply with 16 different laws, but then they're also including things that are for cloud services as well as on-premises services, which again adds to that complexity. Because if a server or a software solution or something is being implemented on premises, under privacy legislation, generally the review of the security will happen by the company where that service is hosted on premises. So the provider wouldn't need to fill in an attestation for that. In this case, this was a cloud provider, so they did have to fill in some questions. But eventually, after looking through all of this stuff, we found that much of it was not necessary. And the important thing that we did, and remember I have on the first point here, it's enforced by risk managers, not cybersecurity staff. One of the best things you can do as a cybersecurity professional filling in one of these forms is to get hold of the company that sent it to you and speak to someone in the information security space, because often they will be able to tell you what questions are valid and which are not. The risk managers won't necessarily be able to tell you that. So get hold of the information officer, the CISO, or a cyber risk manager, someone in the IT governance space, and find out what is actually required. And we did this with the organization. And when it came back, there were only 17 pages that needed to be filled in out of 73. That's a phenomenal difference. Now, the last part of this case that I want to talk to you about is, yes, we got down to 17 pages, but again, different departments had to fill it in, and you need to understand as a professional that there are social aspects to cybersecurity. Now, when we looked at this, the answers that were given in the attestation to go back to this big corporate they came out differently from the sales team, from the management team, and from the cybersecurity team. And again, it spoke to that last slide I mentioned where there is a aspirational sense of how to fill things in. And often you will see when a sale wants to be concluded, people might fill in these attestations saying that they're in a better position than they are. And this was what happened here. So as cybersecurity signing off the final sign off on this, we had to send it back and reduce those exaggerated claims. What happens in these exaggerated claims is you send it back, but under privacy legislation, there is often a clause that lets a company come and audit you. And if you've responded aspirationally saying this is what we do, but it's actually something you're still trying to get to, then they can come and audit you, see that you haven't done it, and then you're in trouble with privacy legislation. You're in trouble with civil legislation because you're now potentially in breach of contract. And then there can be a whole bunch of other administrative issues that come out of it. So it's very important that if you have a risk assessment that you're dealing with it, I think cybersecurity should sign it off as the final point, because it's up to you to keep those responses honest, and it's also up to you to extract things that you can implement that may put the organization in a better position. So I hope this has helped and given you a bit of a view as to the interplays of privacy and cybersecurity. And I would like to thank you for having me. And I think we can jump into a Q&A session to go into this in a bit more detail.